Namaste, and welcome to our continuing series, Essays on the Gita, with our beloved Ranga. We're very happy that this series has become so popular, and we thank you for attending. We are on the chapter 2, The Divine Teacher.
We will start the second chapter today, and as usual, Sri Aurobindo is very, very systematic. First, he has told us in the first chapter that the Gita, what our attitude should be when we are studying the Gita. We will take it for the advice that practical advice that it can give us. We will not concern ourselves too much with its philosophical aspects, because we will use it as a practical guide in our sadhana. And we will not bother too much about the philosophical and the other dialectical aspects and compare it with other texts. That is something we will definitely avoid. The other thing that he also says is that we will, our attitude to it should be that we will not be dogmatic about its teachings. We will keep ourselves flexible, and we will not limit ourselves to any one scripture, however beautiful it be, because all human expression is always a limited representation of the ultimate, ineffable, unspeakable truth. The truth which cannot be put into words. So naturally, any expression that we have of it, it may approach the truth to a great extent, but it is never the absolute truth which is unexpressed. So that's the attitude which will proceed. Then, second chapter, he goes to the divine teacher. And then the next chapter, he goes to the human disciple. And then he goes into the Gita itself, the philosophies, and then the practical aspects he starts one by one. Okay, so today we will go into the second chapter about the divine teacher. I'll read the whole paragraph first, and then we'll come back to it. The peculiarity of the Gita among the great religious books of the world is that it does not stand apart as a work by itself, the fruit of the spiritual life of a creative personality like Christ, Muhammad, or Buddha, or of an epoch of pure spiritual searching like the Veda and Upanishads, but is given as an episode in an epic history of nations and their wars and men and their deeds, and arises out of a critical moment in the soul of one of its leading personages, face to face with the crowning action of his life, a work terrible, violent, and sanguinary, at the point when he must either recoil from it altogether or carry it through to its inexorable completion. It matters little whether or no, as modern criticism supposes, the Gita is a later composition inserted into the mass of the Mahabharata by its author in order to invest its teaching with the authority and popularity of the great national epic. There seem to me to be strong grounds against this supposition, for which, besides, the evidence, extrinsic or internal, is in the last degree scanty and insufficient. But even if it be sound, there remains the fact that the author has not only taken pains to interweave his work inextricably into the vast web of the larger poem, but is careful again and again to remind us of the situation from which the teaching has arisen. He returns to it prominently not only at the end, but in the middle of his profoundest philosophical disquisitions. We must accept the insistence of the author and give its full importance to this recurrent preoccupation of the teacher and the disciple. The teaching of the Gita must therefore be regarded not merely in the light of a general spiritual philosophy or ethical doctrine, but as bearing upon a practical crisis in the application of ethics and spirituality to human life. For what that crisis stands, what is the significance of the battle of Kurukshetra and its effect on Arjuna's inner being, we have first to determine if we would grasp the central drift of the ideas of the Gita. I slipped when I said that he goes on to the philosophy. So these are the four things that, first of all, is approach to the Srimdo's approach to the Gita. Second is the divine teacher. Then next is the human disciple. And then Kurukshetra. Kurukshetra, the war. And that's a very important question. So the necessity of war, is war justified or not? There are 3 chapters on that. A very, very important. What is the role of violence in the world? Does it have a justification or not? It's of great interest to you, yes, particularly because you always worry about the Second World War and the Nazi cruelties.
Well, I'm also recording War and Self-Determination.
Yes.
So
that's right.
It's very important.
So there's 3 chapters on war and violence in the world. Whether it is justified or not, what are the conditions when it is justified. So that is there.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
He speaks about the author of the Gita.
Yeah.
The author of the Mahabharata.
Yes.
Who is the author?
The author is the Vyasa,
Vyasa,
the great sage.
So Vyasa has written the Gita also.
Yes. And Ramayana is written by Valmiki, a poet, and Vyasa also is a poet, but he is also a philosopher. In fact, there are the Brahma Sutras of Badarayana, which are part of the Vedantic teaching, and Badarayana is only another name for Vyasa. So that is what is suspected.
Sri Aurobindo puts them both at the top of all poets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am reading now the Ramayana in the original, and the poetic aspect of it, all that is there in English poetry, alliteration, okay, suggestions, sound effects, onomatopoeic, everything is there even in those lines, okay, suggestions, okay, repetition of words with different meanings. It's fantastic. It's really so.
You are reading it in Sanskrit?
Yes.
Wow.
I want to do that with Mahabharata also, but it will take a little time. Started too late in life. Okay, so let's get back to the beginning of the divine teacher. The peculiarity of the Gita among the great religious books of the world is that it does not stand apart as a work by itself, the fruit of the spiritual life of a creative personality like Christ, Muhammad, or Buddha, or of an epoch of pure spiritual searching like the Veda and Upanishads, but is given as an episode in an epic history of nations and their wars and men and their deeds, and arises out of a critical moment in the soul of one of its leading personages, face to face with the crowning action of his life, a work terrible, violent and sanguinary, at a point when he must either recoil from it altogether or carry it through to its inexorable completion. So, the funny part is that the Bible is based on Christ's teachings. The Quran is based on the Muhammad's teachings, and Buddha is the Buddhist texts are based on Buddha's teachings. But neither Christ wrote the Bible, neither did Buddha write the texts. They were written later on by the followers and the disciples. Okay. About Muhammad also, I don't think that he wrote the Quran. It must have been his teachings which are incorporated into the text, because later on, after the Quran, there were additional texts which are added on to the Quran, like the Hadith. And that is where all sorts of distortions come in. So, that is one of the problems being discussed all over the world now, because Islam is there everywhere, all over the world. It's one of the largest religions. So, that is being discussed now, that should we accept the auxiliary teachings or not. And then there are many branches and all that. So, but the Gita doesn't stand by itself, although we have taken it out of context and we use it as a practical guide in spiritual life, but it is really an episode in the teaching of the Mahabharata, in the exposition of the Mahabharata. The interesting part is that some people think that it's a spiritual teaching. So what has it got to do with the epic? So they say it must have been added later on. But that's not, Sri Aurobindo does not subscribe to that view at all, because there is a continuous reference in the Gita itself to the situation in which he is there. Okay? So constantly you are reminded that it is part of the Mahabharata. So that's what Sri Aurobindo is saying. Not only that, there is another thing which Sri Aurobindo is not very clearly mentioning here, but the symbolism of the Mahabharata fits in very well with the spiritual teachings of the Gita. So there is a great relation between the two, and Sri Aurobindo does not support that. Okay, so very clear. Arjuna is faced with a situation where he has a moral training, and now his morality tells him that it is wrong to kill people, and particularly his own people, even if it is justified. To kill on such a scale is impossible. And added to this killing is the thing that he has to kill his own teachers, his own grandfathers, his own relatives, in-laws. He has to kill all these people. How can that be possible? So he fails, and he has a nervous reaction. His bow falls. The bow falls from his hand. He is in a feverish condition, and he starts trembling. So people would say that what a fine man. He is refusing to do something criminal. But Sri Krishna tells him exactly the opposite. He tells him that no, this is a weakness. And then he goes on to give the teaching. Okay, so this is the situation. And the word sanguinary means bloody from the French word sang. Okay. Sometimes there is a relation between English and French, a lot of common words, and sanguinary means blood, bloody. At the point when he must either recoil from it altogether, which he does, he recoils from it altogether, or carry it through to its inexorable completion, and that's what the Sri Krishna is encouraging him to do. Stand up and fulfill your duty in life. Okay. And the question of Swabhava and Swadharma comes up there, and it's a very interesting discussion in the Gita also, it comes up. Okay? So we'll come to that. When we come to that, we'll discuss it. It matters little whether or no. This is again Sri Aurobindo's English. Normally you would have said whether or not.
Yes, we would, normally.
But he wrote this 100 years ago. Okay? So, not even 100, even more. It matters little whether or no, as modern criticism supposes, the Gita is a later composition inserted into the mass of the Mahabharata by its author in order to invest its teaching with the authority and popularity of the great national epic. So, but this is a charge which can be contested easily, even apart from what Sri Aurobindo is saying, because he is a great spiritual master. He cares a little for fame and name. Okay, they are saying for the popularity of the national epic, so to make it more popular. But that certainly wouldn't have been his aim in doing that. Okay, so there seem to me to be strong grounds against this supposition, for which Besides the evidence, extrinsic or internal. Internal is from the writing itself, or extrinsic means external. Things which don't concern the Mahabharata. The time in which he wrote and other things. Okay. Is in the last degree scanty and insufficient. But even if it be sound, there remains the fact that the author has not only taken pains to interweave his work inextricably into the vast web of the larger poem, but is careful again and again to remind us of the situation from which the teaching has arisen. He returns to it prominently not only at the end, but in the middle of his profoundest philosophical disquisitions. The word disquisition means a piece of long or complex discourse. Okay. We must accept the insistence of the author and give its full importance to this recurrent preoccupation of the teacher and the disciple. What is the preoccupation of the teacher? Constantly reminding him of the situation in which he is, linking it with the epic, the circumstances of the epic. So, the teaching of the Gita must therefore be regarded not merely in the light of a general spiritual philosophy or ethical doctrine, a moral doctrine, but as bearing upon a practical crisis in the application of ethics and spirituality. This is the big problem which Arjuna is facing. Should he apply an ethical solution, morality, or should he apply a spiritual standard? So, this is a big problem, and all those who are in the spiritual field realizes that morality is man-made. The mind of man is giving morality. That's the origin. But spirituality is not man-made. It is a self that lays down the conditions there for the spiritual life. So spiritual life is not man-made. It comes from the higher planes of consciousness. But morality comes from the mind of man. This discussion is also very clearly given in the synthesis of yoga, where he says very clearly that there are 4 standards of conduct. I'm going a little out of the way, but just because it's relevant here. There are 4 standards of conduct. Very largely we can divide human action into 4 standards of conduct. First of all, there is the egoistic standard. When you are at a level where you have to take care of yourself, you have to develop yourself. It's not negative, but it's even you have to develop yourself fully. I want to develop my mind, I want education, okay? I want a happy life, which is valid in a certain sense, okay? So that's a egoistic standard. You pay full attention to yourself and your development. But what happens is, if you are too egoistic and too self-centered, then it's likely that you are going to come into conflict with your neighbor. I'm not going to play, you are not allowed to play your loud music at midnight. It is disturbing your neighbor. That's a problem that is being discussed in India now. Whether the masjids, the mosques, have the right to loudly at 5 o'clock in the morning use the azan, what they call, whether it is valid. Others are getting disturbed. You want to listen to the Quran, fine. But why do you have to make others forcibly listen to your? So this is the moral question that is being discussed today. So the moral question is, you have no right to kill anybody else. So, but the spiritual is slightly different. So that's a discussion that is taking place. So I come back to the standards of conduct. So the first standard of conduct, you have the full right to develop yourself and pay attention to yourself. And that's what happens at the animal level and at the human level below the mental. Most human beings don't have a very, very, what we call the pure mind. The pure mind is that which has got logic, objectivity, and search for truth. Not the physical mind and the vital mind. But the ordinary man uses his physical mind and vital mind mostly, uses the higher logic only to support the lower two. Okay? But the search for true knowledge is there only in the scholar, the scientist, the philosopher, okay? Those who are mentally developed. That's rare, Sri Aurobindo says. So, the second standard is the social standard. Society steps in and says, you can't do this, you can't do that. So, the first standard of conduct is egoism. Valid at its level. But the moment you consider the society at large, you have to take care of your neighbor, you have to take care of society, you can't do anything. You're developing yourself, but in the process, don't disturb the others. So the society steps in. You can't steal, you can't tell lies, you can't do this, you can't do that. Society lays down certain conditions. You can't cross a red light in traffic. So these are all social rules which apply. You have to drive on the right side of the road or the left side in other countries. So these are all social standards. They are social. They are imposed by society on the individuals. The next standard is the moral standard. The third one is the moral standard. Apart from society's non-religious rules, okay, like you can't cross a red light, that's nothing to do with religion or anything. It's not a moral rule. It's just a practical rule. Similarly, individual now finds certain standards of conduct which are not acceptable to his mind. So good and bad, these ideas come in at the mental level. And there, individual imposes his own ideas on society. The second level, society is imposing restrictions on the individual. In the third level of conduct, morality, the individual thinks of what is good and bad and imposes his rules on society. And they are usually accepted because they are acceptable. The last is no rules apply, that's a spiritual standard, which is quite in contradiction with the moral standards. So these are the four standards.
Things here, yeah. So in Oroville, when mother makes one rule, no drugs, those people should leave.
Absolutely ideal condition. That is what you would call spiritual anarchy. Yes. A spiritual anarchy can exist when everybody is developed enough. But otherwise it can become a legal and social anarchy. And that's what's happening to a certain extent there. There's a conflict of interests and people are quarreling among themselves. So spiritual anarchy is the highest standard. And one day it will come. But right now man is not yet ready for that. Yeah.
I also remembered one other thing, apropos of what you are saying about the mind, that I read that Sri Aurobindo wrote to a disciple and he said, the mother and I have discussed him and find that he does not have very much of a mind.
Okay.
Amazing, huh? That he and mother would discuss this person.
He used to always discuss things with the mother and then reply. They were one team. They were not separate individuals. Okay. So, this is the main teaching. At the earlier level is the problem that Arjuna is facing. Should he follow a moral teaching, which he has been brought up in and he has been given the training, or should he go to a spiritual level, which he is not capable of, but he is ready for the spiritual teaching. And that is what Sri Krishna gives him. Okay, and tells him you follow the spiritual law and not the moral law. We'll come to that. When we come, we'll discuss in detail. So, the teaching of the Gita must therefore be regarded not merely in the light of a general spiritual philosophy or ethical doctrine, but as bearing upon a practical crisis in the application of ethics and spirituality to human life. I might as well mention here that the Gita is so practical that nowadays it is being taught in India, at least in the schools of management. If you are to be a manager and you have to manage maybe 100 workers or 2,000 workers, first you learn to manage yourself. And then only you can manage others. So it is being taught in many schools. Okay? The Gita is so practical. What I'm saying is not high-flown philosophy and meaningless and not applicable in life. It is absolutely applicable in life. That's the whole point. Very clear, practical crisis and application of ethics and spirituality. It's a very, very well understood principle now in India at the higher levels of society. Yes, they understand. And they all study the Gita. Okay. For what that crisis stands, what is the significance of the battle of Kurukshetra and its effect on Arjuna's inner being, we have first to determine if we would grasp the central drift of the ideas of the Gita. So he's saying, what is the battle of Kurukshetra? What is the significance of the battle of Kurukshetra? Kurukshetra also is a symbol, a very clearly a symbol. But it is also history. It's very interesting because both Ramayana and Mahabharata is not only symbolic, but they are very, very, their truths are applicable in life. And both these huge, fantastic epics have captured the imagination of India for thousands of years, and they are also part history. Okay? I can give many examples, but definitely Ayodhya still exists, the capital of Ram. Okay? In the Mahabharata, Kurukshetra is still there in Punjab. Okay? So, all these, there are many, many references which tell you that there were historical events which actually... Krishna was definitely a living person. There is a huge debate about Christ, whether he really lived or not. And Krishna also, but Krishna was definitely there because there are many, many things which show that he was in fact, Sri Aurobindo himself experienced Sri Krishna coming and giving him teaching in jail. Nah? So it's very clear that just as Vivekananda also was living, but he came in a subtle body and gave teachings to Sri Aurobindo, Sri Krishna was guiding him in the Gita's teachings as well as the Vedas, in jail. So, very clear that he was a living. So, it's not only poetry and symbolism, but it's also history. So, this is what he says about the teaching, the divine. Very obviously, a great body of the profoundest teaching cannot be built around an ordinary occurrence which has no gulfs of deep suggestion and hazardous difficulty behind its superficial and outward aspects and can be governed well enough by the ordinary, everyday standards of thought and action. There are indeed three things in the Gita which are spiritually significant, almost symbolic, typical of the profoundest relations and problems of the spiritual life and human existence at its roots. They are the divine personality of the teacher, the characteristic relations with his disciple, and the occasion of the teaching. So first is the Sri Krishna, the divine teacher, his characteristic relations with the disciple, and that's very interesting also. We'll see later on what he says about that. There is a relation between Arjuna, the human being, and Sri Krishna, the divine. They are connected. In some philosophies, there is no connection between the two. Man is created, but he has no connection with the divine. He can never become the divine. He can have a relation perhaps, but that's all. Okay, so the three things are the divine personality of the teacher, his characteristic relations with the disciple, his disciple, and the occasion of the teaching, which is the Kurukshetra. The teacher is God himself, descended into humanity. The idea of the concept of the avatar is very common in India. It is almost non-existent anywhere else. That the human can also be divine in essence. So, in fact, it is denied in most other places. Human beings are imperfect and the divine is perfect. There can be no connection between them. But here you are, that the avatar is part human, but also part divine. Essentially divine. The teacher is God himself descended into humanity. The disciple is the first, Arjuna, as we might say in modern language, the representative man of his age, closest friend and chosen instrument of the avatar. He is protagonist in an immense work and struggle, the secret purpose of which is unknown to the actors in it, known only to the incarnate Godhead who guides it all from behind the veil of his unfathomable mind of knowledge. Okay? The occasion is a violent crisis of that work and struggle at the moment when the anguish and moral difficulty and blind violence of its apparent movements forces itself with the shock of a visible revelation on the mind of its representative man and raises the whole question of the meaning of God in the world and the goal and drift and sense of human life and conduct. So, this is also very true. This is very typical of the situation in which Arjuna is there. He is faced with a horrific action. And usually, this type of thing also happens very often in life. You turn towards the inner life after there is something disastrous in your life. Because you start questioning, what is the meaning of life? I'll give you just one instance, okay? And then how it can change your life. The embroidery department in the ashram, the embroidery department, okay, that was a building which was bought by a very well-known and very well-respected lawyer in India. And he was Dorasame Iyengar. Okay, he was very well-known all over in India, and he was a very honest and scrupulous man. Even after he passed away, the newspapers were speaking about him for 3-4 months. Okay, and he was a disciple of Sri Aurobindo. So he bought part of the ashram and he bought this building, and he had I think 2 daughters, maybe 2 or 3, I don't remember. But one of them had a young boy. Okay, her son was a 9-year-old who was run over by a truck. Now imagine the pain of the mother. Okay, why did this boy have to die at the age of 9? Why was he at all made to live if he has to go away in 9 years' time and give us all this pain and suffering? So you start wondering about the meaning of life. What is the meaning of life if you are not given a full scope? What is suddenly it is happening? It's a mystery. And then you start looking for answers. So this sort of disaster very often can cause you to turn to the meaning of life and the world and what is all this, you start wondering. I know of another case in the ashram where when the father died, instead of having grief and pain and suffering, this person suddenly had the experience of the self. A calm, quiet attitude dwelt in her and it was born. So often this either a death or something very disastrous can change. That's a symbolism being given in the... It's not a symbolism, it's an example. That here he has not yet committed the crime, but he is forced to do it because of his Kshatriyahood. He is a Kshatriya and it's his role to defend the right and punish the wrong. So he is faced with this problem.
But in the world, over the ages, we have seen in tragic circumstances that men have turned against the divine.
Yes.
And accused him of not being divine.
That's right. That also happens. When something happens to you, when the ego is very prominent in the being, why did the divine do this to me? Why is he making me suffer? This is very common. Okay. What did I do that I deserved this punishment from God? God is not punishing you. But that's a impression that one gets. I know several cases like that. So, this is the situation. So, it is something so drastic. And Sri Aurobindo is saying that in this para, he is saying that purposely the Gita is dealing with one of the most violent events that can happen in the world. It's not taking a very, very day-to-day event which would be, okay, it's all right. Not like that. It's going to the maximum difficulty. Should I kill or not kill? And that also my own people, my grandfather, my own teacher. I have to kill him in battle. So that's what he's saying here in this para. So we'll quickly go through the para. Okay. Very obviously, a great body of the profoundest teaching cannot be built around an ordinary occurrence which has no gulfs of deep suggestion and hazardous difficulty. So that's why you take the maximum difficult situation and build your theory on it, which has no gulfs of deep suggestion and hazardous difficulty behind its superficial and outward aspects, and can be governed well enough by the ordinary everyday standards of thought and action. So, the situation that Arjuna is facing is not a home problem or some really personal relationship. It's a huge problem for him. That's what Srimad is saying. There are indeed three things in the Gita which are spiritually significant, almost symbolic. Note the word almost symbolic. Okay? Because they are also practical and they are also historical. That's why it's not only symbol. Okay? Typical of the profoundest relations and problems of the spiritual life and of human existence at its roots. So, it's not only symbol, but it's also practical life. So he is telling you what the three things are. The divine personality of the teacher, which is the subject of our present chapter. They are the divine personality of the teacher, his characteristic relations with the disciple, and the occasion of the teaching. You must also remember that Sri Krishna was a very close friend of the Pandavas, and they used to have even social meetings. In other words, he was a friend. The suggestion is that the divine is your friend. We often take him exactly in the opposite. But he is a friend. He is always there for you. And then finally, the occasion of the teaching, which is the Kurukshetra war. Okay? The teacher is God himself, descended into humanity. The disciple is the first, as we might say in modern language, the representative man of his age. Closest friend and chosen instrument of the avatar, his protagonist in an immense work and struggle, the secret purpose of which is unknown to the actors in it, known only to the incarnate Godhead, who guides it all from behind the veil of his unfathomable mind of knowledge. So, this is also true that all human beings have a role to play in the physical world, and they are doing it unconsciously. God knows what the plan is, but we don't know what the plan is. What is our life meant for? You have to discover it. So that's what Srimad is saying here. The occasion is the violent crisis of that work and struggle at the moment when the anguish and moral difficulty and blind violence. Now note, anguish and moral difficulty. Morality is the problem. And blind violence of its apparent movements forces itself with the shock of a visible revelation on the mind of its representative man, and raises the whole question of the meaning of God in the world and the goal and drift and sense of human life and conduct. So,
can we say this was also why Sri Aurobindo was so concerned about World War II?
Yes, absolutely. He saw it as a Kurukshetra.
Yes, yes.
He saw it and he saw it clearly that if the Axis powers win, the world will be plunged for centuries into a situation from which it will take many, many centuries to come out again. And that's why he took up the challenge, and from Pondicherry sitting here, he was manipulating forces in the physical world and giving help to the allies. And at that time, the main protagonist in that whole thing was Churchill.
Yeah.
And Sri Aurobindo says, It's very interesting. Churchill was a very interesting character, and you can really start wondering about it. Now, so many movies have come out about Churchill, and he was considered at that time, the popular nation is that Churchill was a great leader. But from the human point of view, he was a disgustingly despicable character. Okay? He caused the death of millions in a famine on purpose. The 1942 famine in Bengal was because all the rice that was available in India were being diverted to the troops. Okay, this is a well-known fact. And he said, what is it when the English themselves raise a question that you are going to cause a famine and many will die? He says, what does it matter if they die? They are breeding like rabbits anyway. That was his comment. And he was a very big racialist. Everybody knows that. So in fact, that's why they're pulling down his statues and all that in England today.
The other thing was that Sri Aurobindo, I believe, said he even spoke through church.
That's right. And that's exactly what I'm coming to. That's my point. That from the ordinary point of view, you may be a most ordinary or even someone whom you consider disgusting character. But he was an instrument of the divine. And Sri Aurobindo said, I am able to work through him.
Yeah.
And not only that, the other interesting thing is that Churchill was conscious. He made a statement in the parliament that I know we are going to win because I can sense a guidance. He made this statement in parliament. So he didn't know who was guiding him, but he knew that there is a guidance from within. That's why he was so sure of his victory. In fact, the Dunkirk thing, okay, the Dunkirk incident was very interesting because all his generals, all the military people in England were telling him, start negotiating with Hitler because we are sure to lose. 300,000 of our troops are lying like sitting ducks in Dunkirk. All Germany has to do is come and throw a couple of bombs and finish. The war is won. But it didn't happen. And he refused to surrender. He said, no, I won't. Because there was guidance from within. So, in fact, there are many interesting movies which have just come out now.
When I listen to some of his speeches,
fantastic.
They're almost Sri Aurobindo's words.
Absolutely. His most famous speech, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight in war, we shall do this, we shall do that. We are not going to ever surrender. It shows the great power that he was being given from somewhere else. And interestingly, it's not a subject of the Gita, but after the war, he lost the election. And the reason is that most people in Britain found him a horrible character. Okay? And he was thrown out of power. And he told his wife, I can't understand how this nation is throwing me out after I won the war. So, then he was a very big wit. Nah? Churchill was very witty. So he told his wife told him, Winston, don't worry. It must be a blessing in disguise. He told him. It's a blessing but in disguise. So he retorted. He said, it is extremely well disguised right now. So that's the thing. And then he came back into power afterwards.
Yeah.
India has, from ancient times, held strongly a belief in the reality of the avatar, the descent into form, the revelation of the Godhead in humanity. In the West, this belief has never really stamped itself upon the mind because it has been presented through exoteric Christianity. Note, exoteric, not esoteric. Christianity as a theological dogma without any roots in the reason and general consciousness and attitude towards life. But in India, it has grown up and persisted as a logical outcome of the Vedantic view of life and taken firm root in the consciousness of the race. What is the Vedantic view of life? That everything is the divine. There is only one divine. There is nothing undivine. That's the thing. So naturally, the human being can be divine. So the avatar is possible. All existence is a manifestation of God because He is the only existence, and nothing can be except as either a real figuring or else a figment of that one reality. There's a philosophical suggestion here which we'll discuss next time. Therefore, every conscious being is in part or in some way a descent of the infinite into the apparent finiteness of name and form. But it's a veiled manifestation, and there is a gradation between the Supreme Being of the Divine and the consciousness shrouded partly or wholly by ignorance of self in the finite. The conscious embodied soul is a spark of the divine fire, and that soul in man opens out to self-knowledge as it develops out of ignorance of self into self-being. The divine also, pouring itself into the forms of the cosmic existence, is revealed ordinarily in an efflorescence of its powers, in energies and magnitudes of its knowledge, love, joy, developed force of being, in degrees and phases of its divinity. But when the divine consciousness and power, taking upon itself the human form and the human mode of action, possesses it not only by powers and magnitudes, by degrees and outward phases of itself, but out of its eternal self-knowledge, when the unborn knows itself and acts in the frame of the mental being and the appearance of birth, that is the height of the conditioned manifestation. Conditioned manifestation. It is the full and conscious descent of the Godhead. It is the avatar. So he has defined what the avatar is, and we will go into detail next time. We'll reread this one. It's full of suggestions, so we'll see what it's saying. Okay? So.
Thank you, Ranga. Namaste all.